I'm Dan Carter, and I'm ecologist for the Prairie enthusiasts. And you might be wondering, why I'm here to talk about oak woodlands, because I'm here on behalf of the Prairie enthusiasts. And hopefully, in the course of this talk, that'll become a little bit more clear. But the long story short, there is that um, we're a group, largely a grassroots group that's volunteer driven, that works in upper Midwestern fire dependent ecosystems that are all closely related to and tied to one another. And oak woodlands have become one of my sort of special interests. Um, Probably started, within the last 10 years, I've really become sort of passionate about oak woodlands. And I'll talk about one of the sites that really drove that. But several years ago, I had a fellowship with the Milwaukee Public Museum, which supported some work that I was able to do in oak woodlands that later was used to inform the development of some ecological assessment tools, in particular for oak woodlands in the state of Wisconsin. Um, and there, hopefully I that's what I talk about a lot, is that assessment tool. And this is sort of a different talk, so hopefully I don't slide into that. Um, but yeah, I'd like to also express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here. Um, it's very nice to be in a space where other people are that care, and um, where people are talking about and learning from one another about ways that we can, do good, make a positive difference. And it's not just for these ecosystems or the species that use them, but it's also for us, because we're a part of this, and we also benefit as individuals and as communities from the work we do, and not just in concrete ways, but kind of just in well-being and in spiritual ways. So today I'm really just kind of going to be trying to introduce oak woodlands and maybe sow the seeds of some appreciation for them, and maybe um, you know help people have more of an eye for discerning where those opportunities might be on the landscape where you are. And I'll talk a little bit about approaches for caring for them or restoring them, but fairly broadly, because there's a great deal of site level uniqueness. So I won't be terribly prescriptive. There are some more general, very important factors like fire and its role in these ecosystems that I'll speak more to. But there are a lot of other specifics that are sort of beyond the scope of this. So I'm going to start out with this picture in talking about what an oak woodland is. And this is a remnant old growth oak woodland in southeastern Wisconsin. And it was this particular place, and it was this particular visit where I took this photo of this place that really, in me, got me passionate about oak woodlands. And it's really where I started to learn more about them and understand maybe a little bit about what they are and how they work. Um, but just look at this picture, and I'll have a few more pictures here just at the beginning of the presentation. You just want to walk into it. It's sort of ethereal, but it's this open community. And you can see right away that, while you have all of these trees, these are white oaks predominantly in the picture, it's bright. It's a bright timber. You can see the dappled light there on the ground. And that's one of the characteristics of these, is there's a sort of more homogeneous condition of dappled light versus a more open savanna that has bigger gaps between oak trees, and you have areas that are in more strong direct sunlight in contrast with the shade. It also is grassy. It's actually grassy and sedgy. and it has a lot of forbs. And I'll show some pictures I took the same day that illustrate that a little better. But there's a grassland under the oak trees, and that's important to recognize. That's an important part of these systems. If you look at the trees themselves, their growth habit is not as it's not as low and broad and spreading as it is in an open savanna, nor is it as tall and reaching for light as it is in a darker, more closed forest. And you can even see kind of across the top of the screen, hopefully, some of those lower oak limbs hanging down, and they're still alive. They've got oak leaves on them. There's enough light for those. In fact, there's enough light for oak to regenerate on the ground in this system with this level of light. Just another picture. So that first picture was southeastern Wisconsin at this remnant at Army Lake. This is an oak woodland remnant that someone's starting to work on in the Driftless area in Iowa County, Wisconsin. Again, white oak dominated. This is later in the year. You can see sort of the sedgy ground layer there. In the very foreground, some of those darker, broader leaves, those are white oaks regenerating in the white oak shade of the woodland. Another example that someone's restoring, this is I believe in Grant County, Wisconsin, in southwestern Wisconsin. And again, those broad leaves, those are actually regenerating white oaks in this oak woodland. Looking a little more closely at what's going on the ground, these are very rich systems because they're bright. And they have a lot of grasses and sedges. They're like grasslands. They also have a lot of flowering plants. And so here you see all these Midland shooting stars. And some people might associate those with prairies, and they occur in prairies, but they also occur in oak woodlands. This is the same site, and this is sort of blurry, but this is under the canopy I showed in that first picture on the same day. And you see all of that yellow stargrass and the robin's plantain and the wood betony that's finished blooming. And if you're a good botanist, you might squint and start looking at what some of these other things are. And there are things that are going to be blooming all season. There's a sky blue aster. There's low bindweed. There's yellow false foxglove. Another image in another area in oak woodland, again under canopy, Carolina vetch. Two-flowered Cynthia. I had to turn this on its side because I took a vertical picture foolishly. False toadflax, Commandra. Again, another one people usually will associate with prairies, but it's also a species of these woodlands. I'll put some descriptions to this other than, getting beyond just pictures. And the first one, I'll have to explain a little bit. Greater than 40% canopy closure. And that's different than canopy cover in a woodland. So the cover is sort of the broad outline of the canopy. But these canopies, especially in a mature woodland, have gaps within them. And so they let through this dappled light. Canopy closure is the coverage of those shade dapples, the shade patches on the herbaceous plants, the ground, the low shrubs that are beneath the canopy. It's the coverage of that. And in a mature oak woodland, we find that canopy closure is generally above 40%. It's also generally below about 65%. It depends on the species of oaks that are present, largely in a high quality oak woodland. As I mentioned, the older trees generally have taller boles or trunks. They're not as short and squat as open grown oak trees are in an open savanna. One of the things that's special about these is that there's this great intersection of communities that happens in these oak woodlands, and that might also occur on the same landscapes. So we'll have representation of some of the prairie flora because it's bright enough. We'll have representation of some of the flora of deeper, darker woods because it's just dark enough. And we'll have some species there that really do like to grow in the in-between. And a lot of these are species, because woodlands have become so rare, a lot of these are species you'll read habitat descriptions and it'll say forest edge. Well, really, they're woodland species that have been confined to the forest edges. So those forests have become darker. They were once woodlands. More often, at least in the upper Midwest, white oak is a predominant tree, often in combination with northern red oak, Quercus rubra, and black oak, Quercus velutina. Sometimes these woodlands, though, consist of bur oaks, bur oak groves. I'm thinking of places like south central Minnesota or central and northern Iowa, where I'm from originally. Bur oak is often increasingly important. And usually that's in association with a broader prairie, more open savanna landscape. I've mentioned this herbaceous vegetation, this grassland vegetation under the oaks. And so I borrowed this from Veldman and others, and these are more general characteristics, thinking about old growth grasslands, including those in savannas and under woodlands globally, but they're very true, at least many of these are very true of the vegetation in our oak woodlands. The herbaceous plants that are predominant tend to be slow growing and long lived. They have good resprouting capacity. They have low success establishing from seed or colonizing over distance. And that's a flip side of that is their seed banks. And we talk about seed banks a lot, especially those of us involved in restoration. Well, most of the species associated with old growth have very transient seed banks, meaning they don't last long in the soil. So if plants have not flowered and set seed in recent years, they're absent in the seed bank. And it's significant for what we do when we're restoring these sites. The trees in these systems clearly tend to be fire tolerant trees. I'll also highlight when these systems are healthy, there tends to be little accumulation of litter or duff. That's really critical for their ability to support healthy herbaceous plant communities and for their nutrient cycling and for fire behavior to be such that it's benign or beneficent in these systems rather than harsh or damaging. Some pictures of the flora, some species that tend to be associated with old growth, at least in upper Midwestern oak woodlands. We have things like wood betony, which we also see in prairies, alum root, which we also see in prairies, poke milkweed, which we do tend to see in woodlands, especially, and pale vetchling as well, and grove sandwort in the bottom middle, forked aster in the lower left. Forked aster is a Midwestern regional and endemic that really finds its best home in bright but moist oak woodlands. The false foxgloves, heart-leaved skullcap. And again, these represent things that flower in spring and later in the season because the flora is not restricted to pre-leaf out light levels. Even after the oaks leaf out, there's plenty of light. The grassy vegetation, at least in the upper Midwest, tends to consist of species like these broad-leaved panic grass, savanna running sedge, Pennsylvania sedge. Pennsylvania sedge is probably the most widespread in its importance. Black-seeded rice grass, bearded short husk. You may not have heard of some of these. You may want to restore oak woodland. You might find that these species are not commercially available. Wood rush, common wood rush in the lower right. An important characteristic, and this is true in oak woodlands, it's true in oak savannas, it's true in our prairies, but the herbaceous vegetation in high integrity, healthy, old growth systems is structured more by limiting nutrient availability than it is by competition for light. That's very significant. So it tends to be lower in stature because plants that are successful in that setting, they're deploying all these myriad strategies that have to do with phenology, that have to do with protecting the hard-won nutrients they have, that have to do with their symbioses, their relationships to one another, to make a home in that system. And it's much more simple when nutrients are not limiting and it's light that is. Species tend to be weedy and grow tall and fast. There are fewer ways to capitalize on that situation. And that's often what we confront. And when we're restoring these systems, we're often starting at a point where nutrients are not limiting and it poses a challenge. So the picture on the far right sort of illustrates that. This is an oak woodland undergoing restoration. The white flower is Culver's root, which is great, but there's abundant tall goldenrod there. And these clonal goldenrods are often symptomatic of this. But really what's going on here is that there's high nutrient availability in the wake of opening things up. And that's something that needs to be worked out for this system to be able to support greater diversity at smaller scales, sort of the rich flora typical of old growth woodlands. Just to also get us on the same page here, I have some pictures of other oak communities that I'm not emphasizing here. So, you know, I've mentioned savanna, and this is really what that looks like in the upper Midwest, with more of a prairie vegetation clearly in the open and these open grown oak trees. Or another expression of savanna we see are barrens, or we sometimes call these oak barrens, and they tend to be dominated in the upper Midwest by black oak or Hills oak, and they may be associated with pine. They tend to occur on sandy, often acidic soils. Southern dry music forests, or these more closed forest types that have oak as important members, and the biggest canopy trees here are northern red oaks. They're kind of a tricky one because a lot of these sites have been getting more closed over time, and we look at them now and it's hard to really know exactly where they're coming from. Some of them may have been much more like woodlands, like I've shown you already. But I believe that these sorts of brighter forests also existed and had space on the landscape. But this is a picture of a site that still has decent herbaceous vegetation in it. You see a lot of long-beaked sedge there and mayapple, but it's getting darker and it has less in it that grows and flowers later in the season. I'm not talking about these types of forests so much. So I really come at oak woodlands because I don't know, just sort of intrinsically, I feel they have value or beauty. I don't know. I'm moved by them, but they do support many of our rare and declining species, and that's another reason why they're important to recognize and protect and conserve and restore. And it's a broad range of species, and they're not necessarily species that are restricted to oak woodlands, but there are many species that use them for parts of their life cycles, or many species that are, when oak woodlands are in good condition, that's sort of the ideal habitat. These opportunities, I think, and I see this all the time, are often overlooked, and that often comes from our concepts that we learn when we're in school, those of us in conservation. And so in the state of Wisconsin, which is where I work, there's not an oak woodland concept in Curtis's vegetation of Wisconsin. That was also a really important work in early community and ecology that had a lot of influence. There's southern dry and southern dry music forest, and those overlap with our oak woodlands. And those were based on the trees. But at the end of that book, there are tables of herbaceous plants that were in those communities. And those tables list plants that were prevalent or modal, which means they were most frequent in those communities. And those include species like flowering spurge, which is also an important native forb or wildflower in our wide open prairies. So clearly these were bright. Starry campion is another. Purple giant hyssop and poke milkweed are others. Those are woodland plants. Those are plants we see in woodlands and on the contemporary landscape. And so that overlap with forest community types has gotten in the way, I think. And then just to add to confusion in Wisconsin in particular, oak woodlands are considered a subtype of savanna. And most people, when we talk about savannas, visualize these open communities with their scattered oak trees. And it can lead people to make decisions in oak woodlands that can be counterproductive. And so I have a picture here. This is I visit landowners a lot that are members of the Prairie Enthusiasts, or our chapters have me visit sites, and I walk through places like this. And this is a once upon a time oak woodland. And if you look at it, you can filter through some of what's there and see the oak woodland in there. The oak trees, the canopy oak trees, are still there. Some of the sedges and the more shade tolerant elements of the woodland, they're still there. They haven't been shaded out, but this is getting shadier. We have other non-oak hardwoods coming up through the understory and into the canopy. But sites like this are just real amazing opportunities to not even that heavy of a lift to start to have some real benefits for not just oak woodland in its own right, but for all of the life that benefits from and depends on oak woodlands. So where are these oak woodlands just sort of generally? The kinds of oak woodlands I'm talking about, Eastern North American oak woodlands, really occur from central Minnesota to southeastern Canada and New England, and southward just about to the Gulf Coast, over tremendous gradients of temperature and precipitation and seasonality of precipitation. The common denominator for most, and there are some eccentricities, there are some really particular cases that will express, where the land will express oak woodland without it, but the common denominator for most is the interaction of frequent past cultural burning with topography and soils and water on the landscape. Those things in interaction with one another express oak woodland. It varies a little bit by region, but fire is really the common denominator there. And so that's something we really have to view less as something we might do to these systems or a treatment we might impose on them, but it's really a part of them. It's when there is fire in these systems, we're observing a core ecological process within these systems that sustains them, that stabilizes them if we're doing it right, if we're doing it well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the right kind of fire is stabilizing. It's a part of these systems. It's not destabilizing. And so we talk about fire as a disturbance, and sometimes that language kind of fails us. And I take a lot of hope out of this, where oak woodlands are that are substantially similar in the context of climate change, because fire is something, it's something that we can use, and it's a great stabilizing factor. And I'll mention nutrient deposition more in a moment, but I'll just show you here, white oak is a core tree, and this is its broader range, but over much of this range, it's a significant member of oak woodlands. Likewise, underbrush in oak woodlands, one of the main species is New Jersey tea. And we might associate that with open savannas and prairies, but healthy oak woodlands support New Jersey tea, and it's one of the major low shrubby species in them. And it largely reflects this historical extent of our Eastern North American oak woodlands. I'll just emphasize fire, and this is coming from Hanbury and others. And it's in the context of open forest and woodland systems in North America, but under regulated anthropogenic application and in conjunction with edaphic and topographic conditions, low severity surface fire was the primary stabilizing mechanism in most open forest systems. We just can't get away from that. I mentioned nitrogen deposition. So climate change is a stressor in our oak woodlands. I think it's one that we're empowered to work against. Another major stressor is nutrient deposition, and in particular nitrogen. And what this shows on the left two panels are oxidized nitrogen deposition, nitrate and nitrite, and those are mostly from industrial sources. And from top to bottom there, you see early 2000s to more recently, we've made progress in reducing those, in regulating our emissions. But on the right are reduced nitrogen deposition, which is ammonia and ammonium. And that's largely coming from agriculture, our spreading of manure and fertilizer on the landscape. That's something that's getting much worse, particularly in parts of the country, and very acutely worse where there's a lot of confined livestock on the landscape, and that excess manure has to be spread locally. But just to get an idea of what this is. And so, if you wanted to maximize dollar return on an acre of corn, you might be advised to put 150 to 200 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen on it per year. This sort of universal everywhere deposition of nitrogen on the landscape in much of the upper Midwest is on the order of a tenth of that. So that happening everywhere on the landscape every 10 years. That's still a lot. And again, remember I said old growth, especially in the herbaceous vegetation, it's structured by limiting nutrient availability versus competition for light. And what this starts to do is shift that balance towards competition for light. But if we burn through fine fuels like leaf litter and grasses and sedges, what we do at the site scale is we volatilize a decent percentage of the nitrogen that's in that litter and export it out of the system. Where are oak woodlands more specifically? And now I'm going to talk about where you might find like remnants of historical oak woodlands. And so I have some land survey notes here on the left. This is in southeastern Wisconsin. On the right, I have an image that shows you topography. It's a LiDAR hillshade image. And this is this is a glaciated region. And we have a survey section boundaries, the straight lines. Those survey sections are a mile square. And the original land survey moved along those lines. And so if you look at that line going bottom to top through the middle of that image, these land survey notes correspond to that line going from the bottom to the top, from south to north. So down towards the bottom, the surveyor encountered a bur oak, 13 inches in diameter. And this is the sort of thing you see. It says deep Indian trail. It says some wagons have passed over it. At the quarter section, so halfway along this transect where the quarter section post went in, the bearing trees to help mark that post were both white oaks. It's W oak, and then below that, that's ditto. They were white oaks. It was oak woodland because at that point it had moved into that more broken topography, that hillier topography versus the more level. And then that transect entered a tamarack swamp just to the west of a lake and came out of it again, encountered another white oak, again on that hillier topography. And then the section corner at the end of that transect was just barely out into wetland again, and the bearing trees were back behind on the upland wetland edge, and it was a red oak and an aspen. And so this really tells us a lot. And there are descriptions at the bottom. The first half of the transect, it refers to a previous entry, so we have to go back, but that says land rolling, first rate sandy, bur oak plains, open savanna. On those level lands, wind could drive fire. And the expression was open savanna, or in some cases, open prairie, where that was true in this part of the country. But the northern half, it says hilly, broken, second rate, white and yellow oak. That is, yellow oak is black oak. It's white oak, black oak, woodland. And that acorn is where it's on a knoll, and I'll talk more about these upland knolls. That little acorn is where that first picture is that I showed you, that remnant oak woodland. The best remaining sites we have where we've found them are on these convex landforms. And in areas that were glaciated, this is especially upland knolls that are surrounded by peatlands, wetlands, and or water. And so here we have, again, some hillshades, some topography on the left, and you see this upland knoll in the middle. One morning before a meeting, I wanted to see if I could find a spot near me to go look at for a remnant oak woodland, and I came across this. And I looked at the historical air photo back in the early 1940s, and I could see that little upland knoll was wooded. And then there are tamaracks to the east of it and the west, and a bog to the north. And that's actually reed canary grass marsh hay to the south. It's a converted sedge meadow. And I looked at a more recent air photo of it, and I saw it's still wooded, but it looks different. You see north, south, east, and west in that air photo, it looks dark. That's invading glossy and common buckthorn. We have the former reed canary grass hay in the sedge meadow to the south. We have an open wetland to the south, which is actually turning back into sedge meadow on its own. And it's March, it's still frozen. So I walked out there. And this is what I saw. The picture on the right is what I encountered. And I saw the white oak trees. And under the white oak trees, it's not buckthorn. And during the growing season, it's got this grassy, sedgy vegetation, and it has all these things that you find in oak woodlands, like false toad flax and Carolina vetch, still hanging on there. So why is this? So this is a site that hasn't had any real human involvement with it for a long time. It hasn't had fire in it, but it's a convex landform. It's next to an open wetland, I should say. It's surrounded by deep peatland, and it was inaccessible to livestock in the growing season. It wasn't historically grazed. Sites that were seem to be a lot more invaded by buckthorn and honeysuckle in our region. And what that open wetland next to it does, and I saw this on the day I was visiting in March because it was windy, but it blows the leaf litter off of it. So it does some of what fire would do. It removes the leaf litter that would otherwise smother some of this vegetation eventually. It removes the leaf litter and the nutrients that are in it from the site. So it's doing some of fire's job. At least that's what we think is going on. It's some of why we're finding remnants in places like this. And I'll give this anecdote. You can see all the yellow stargrass in this picture. This is the surface of a burial mound in a rich oak woodland in southern Wisconsin. And there's some fescue there because this had been mowed for a time to keep it open. Hasn't been mowed recently. But this is a bur oak, white oak woodland, but rich. It's got trillium, it's got blue cohosh, it's got hypoxis, it has yellow stargrass. Where is it? It's on the burial mound, on the convex landform, where the leaf litter nonetheless continues to blow off. It was also probably maintained by the mowing for some time. But when you start when you visit places like this and you see things like this and what it has to say, I mean, there's what the wisdom that is in these places and how they still express themselves and what they tell you about the past and the people that were there. It's a moving thing. We also find remnants associated with hillier topography, like in the driftless area of Wisconsin, or where there's more sort of morainal or glacial topography or drumlin fields. So on these hills or bluffs, and often on north and east aspects, because often the south and west aspects were open prairie or oak savanna, again, because of the behavior of fire. So this is a site that was protected for the remnant prairie that was hanging on the south slope, but there's actually an oak woodland remnant on the north slope. And again, maintaining some of its quality because there it has some exposure and the leaf litter is exported by wind. So how can we restore and care for these oak woodlands where they exist on the landscape? And so, a lot of them look like this. Some of them look worse. The first important thing that we can do is do no harm. It takes a long time for old growth to recover, but we can facilitate that. We can make it faster. But we have to recognize, and I need to and move things here for myself so I can see what I have. But we can recognize some of these expressions of oak woodland sites on the landscape. Some are easier, and I put this in quotes. They still have trees. They still have their graminoids, their grasses and sedges. They're things like Pennsylvania sedge. They can carry fire. They still support remnant populations or communities of old growth associated plants. They might be thinned out. They might be sparse. They might be patchy. And, it's a pretty straightforward formula. And again, I'm not going to get into specifics, but a lot of times there's invasive brush that we need to remove or eliminate. These sites need fire back, and it needs to be frequent. It needs to be in the dormant season so that it's benign to the old growth vegetation that we're trying to recover. We need to reintroduce species that are missing. And if we need to, sometimes we need to thin the overstory if it's too shady. And you might look at this site and you might think, this is oak woodland. I see all these shagbark hickory trees. And historically it was, in the original land survey it was. Then it was cleared to plant an orchard. And that orchard was abandoned, and shagbark hickory disproportionately recolonized it, but there's still white oak here. But it's actually a remnant oak woodland. There's old growth herbaceous sod here. And this landowner has removed invasive brush and excessive red maple trees and has been burning this in the dormant season, actually every year for the last several years, with just amazing results. There are sites that are a little more difficult. I say moderate here because we can still introduce ecological process. They might not have native sedges and grasses or much of their old growth herbaceous vegetation, but they still have enough leaf litter to carry fire. So we have a hope to get ecological process back, but we still have to eliminate unwanted brush and understory woody vegetation. They need fire. We need to do more to reintroduce those old growth associated species from seed or even from roots or plugs for things like Pennsylvania sedge, so that vegetation can recover, because the seed bank will not typically be there. And again, oftentimes the overstory needs some thinning, but we can take our time with this. We don't want to turn the light level up too high because nutrient availability will be higher in the beginning, just from the leaf litter of non-oak woody species. And if we turn up the light too much, weedy species will have a real advantage, and their competition for light will give them a real advantage. The most difficult sites are just very nutrient enriched or eutrophic. And this is what this looks like. And this is all native herbaceous vegetation, and that's a white oak growing up through it. But there are other overstory trees putting down leaf litter that decomposes very quickly, and brush that is putting down leaf litter that decomposes very quickly. And it speeds up nutrient cycling and makes the nitrogen in the system more available to plants like this that live fast. So we have annual things like clearweed and three-seeded mercury dominating in the herbaceous vegetation. These sites are more difficult. And a lot of that's because they're less flammable. So it's a real struggle trying to move beyond this vegetation and to get fire back. But once you do that, it's pretty much the same general outline. We have to deal with the underlying problem, which will often be the litter inputs from non-oak woody vegetation. We have to get, especially grassy and sedgy vegetation, because it has slower decomposing litter. It benefits the nutrient dynamics. If microbes are trying to decompose that, those have to pull in nutrients from the surrounding environment. And so it starts to shift that balance. Some things to think about doing or not doing. I think a lot of times we try to do too much too fast. A lot of times we're in a hurry. And one of the things I advise people against is cutting or burning through brush without killing it. And that's especially true if there's any chance that there's desirable old growth associated vegetation that's just barely hanging on under there. And I mean, I've seen Midland shooting stars persisting as leaves that are the size of my pinky fingernail, if those might be there. Because if we do this sort of thing and we we don't successfully eliminate that woody vegetation, oftentimes it ends up looking like that picture on the right. That's all common buckthorn, and it's worse than it was when it started. And if you want to deal with that problem, you have to use heavy-handed approaches that will often also kill any remaining old growth associated species. One approach that sometimes people use, and I've seen used to great success, and works especially well with some of our native woody vegetation that can just become overabundant, like brambles or maybe hazel, things that belong but in lower abundance, is a couple growing season mowings a couple years in a row, which shift the balance towards the native sedges and grasses that really form the matrix of a healthy woodland. Don't think that an oak woodland or an oak dominated forest should be thinned to a savanna canopy in one fell swoop. Not in the name of oak regeneration, because that can happen under oak. And certainly not if the site was historically oak woodland, like the pictures I have here. So there's a historical photo that's on the left and it's dormant, so it's harder to make it out, but there's a canopy there in the late 30s. And that canopy carried through all the way through till recently. The fields to the north were planted with pines or left fallow. And in the name of conservation, this is a conservation site. It was quote unquote restored to savanna by dramatically thinning the predominantly oak canopy there. And this is what it looked like on the ground after that. And what this does, so that system had probably been getting darker. It didn't have any of the more light-loving vegetation, herbaceous vegetation remaining. Its herbaceous vegetation would have been thinned out, and suddenly it's bathed in light. It's bathed in available nutrients. And it grows tall and weedy with goldenrod and Canada thistle. And faster growing trees are going to be replacing these oaks, like black cherry and black locust and box elder and elms. And this often happens. People often get the advice to do dramatic things in stands of oak in the name oftentimes of regeneration of oak. But that doesn't happen anymore when the vegetation grows dense and tall and weedy like this. Oaks regenerate when things look like this. And they grow in the understory, they resprout under fires until there's an opening, and they have a chance to grow more quickly and get above the fire. And that's just what this is showing. Some oak canopy, and then under that canopy, we've got white oak and bur oak even. The vegetation is low enough that they're not getting a secondary level of shading from the herbaceous plants, and they're thriving and they're waiting for an opening. So consider starting small and starting slow, and learn from your early efforts and develop seed sources as you do your restoration work. And these are just examples from a landowner that's doing that and being patient. Think about where these oak woodlands were on the landscape and be wary of fire intensity, especially if these sites haven't burned recently and they have a lot of leaf litter and down debris built up. If you run fire up hills, you can kill these oak trees. So you have to be careful. Avoid also burning during the growing season, because any old growth herbaceous vegetation there is, much of it is actively growing at that time, and you'll harm it. That's something that you might use or deploy only in very specific and targeted situations. Shrubs were a component in these systems, so retain patches of those for habitat, things like hazel and snowberry, even prickly ash in the upper Midwest. And I've mentioned this already, but don't assume there's a seed bank, because there's not a seed bank that reflects the old growth vegetation in the wake of this removal. Usually it's just tiny plants that weren't detected, that were dying their slow deaths in the shade, that recover. And before you get started, and this is really important, you need to identify available resources and understand the costs before you get going, because prescribed burning is a real need. And it's something that our capacity to do is very limited. And so it's something you have to think about, how is that going to happen? And how is it going to happen in the right way, at the right time, at the right frequency? Where are you going to get seeds? Not all of these species are commercially available. And while you do this, it's also important, I think, and it's people like me learn from this when people do this, and I visit sites and talk to people and learn from them. But the people that are most in tune with their restoration projects document their work, they document their practices, they take pictures, they keep species lists, they record what they add in terms of species that were missing and they're adding back. They record what they add back, how they did it, when they did it, whether it was successful. And if you do those things, it is possible to have amazing success. And it's not something you finish, because these are systems that were only on the landscape because of people and people's relationship to them and that reciprocity. And that's something that we have to carry through these systems in order to be successful. And they don't get back to their old growth structure and composition right away, but there can be a night and day difference for wildlife much more quickly. And that's what this picture shows. And this property line is public conservation land on the left, but not stewarded. And stewarded land on the right, somebody that's restoring their oak woodland. And this is, you walk through there, there's abundant floral resources, there are birds, cerulean warblers, all these things are there. And so we can have fantastic success. I shared some resources and they've been put up on the website for the summit, and most of those are here and reiterated again. But I would emphasize for you The Once and Future Great Lakes Country and Ecological History by John L. Riley as something to read, just generally, especially if you're in the upper Midwest or Great Lakes region or New England. And with that, thanks. And I hope you look out for oak woods.